Have you ever looked at other unschoolers and thought they lead exciting lives and we don't? Maybe you've seen unschoolers who are traveling the world. Well, not at the moment, but maybe they were traveling the world. Or maybe going around your country in a camper van. Or maybe you know somebody who lives in a yurt or on a farm or somewhere that's very different from where you live. And that was a situation a few years ago. I was looking at all these other unschoolers and feeling very dissatisfied with our life in a conventional house on an average size block in the centre of town. Yes, I thought that my kids would be so much better off if we moved somewhere more exciting, that maybe even it was essential for unschooling that they had exposure to such things as growing our own vegetables, maybe living off-grid. I mean, that sounds exciting, doesn't it? Think of all the things kids could learn about if we were in the middle of the country off-grid. Yeah, do a bit of weaving, have a few goats, a donkey maybe. Yes, grow your own food. Well, this is what I was thinking about a number of years ago. And one day a friend told me about a cottage that was for rent on a fish farm. Now, the rent was not very much at all because instead of paying a lot of rent, the owner of the fish farm wanted somebody to live in his cottage and to feed the fish. Now, feeding the fish was very easy. All you had to do was get a bucket of chook food and walk down to the dams maybe once or twice a day and sprinkle it in. So I thought, we could do this, and the rent's cheap, and maybe we would have a huge adventure. So I told my husband about the cottage and said, "Hey, Andy, can we move to this cottage on the fish farm?" And being a sensible man, my husband said, "Sue, it will take me 2.5 hours to get to work." But I said, "Look, perhaps you can change jobs. This fish farm seems too good to turn up. We could save a lot of money if we moved there, and then maybe one day we'd be able to afford a home of our own. Because we've been renting houses for a long time, but yes, we yearned to have a house that we didn't have to keep moving out of when the landlord wanted to move in and wanted to sell. We wanted a secure place just for our family." So I got Andy to agree to come and have a look at the cottage. So one weekend we drove a long way out into the country to look at this cottage, and oh my, it was rather tumbled down. It was only a 2-bedroom cottage, and we had, I think, 5 children at the time, and there were a lot of things wrong with the cottage. Cracked windows. It was in poor repair. And I should have been sensible, and I should have said, "Hey, no, this was a stupid idea," but I didn't. I just looked at the 100 acres that the cottage was on, and I said to Andy, "Look what we could do. Look, our kids, they could roam free, be wild and free on all this land. There's kangaroos here. Just imagine living on a property with your own mob of kangaroos. Our kids could get dirty. We could have adventures." So, and he said he'll think about it, but I didn't think he was going to change his mind. But the kids, when they heard that maybe we could get a dog, they kept nagging him as well. "Oh, Dad, we'd love to live on the fish farm. We could have a dog. It would be great." So Andy said, "All right, we'll give it a go." And the plan was to move out to the fish farm, and he would start looking for a job. And we would travel back to town for all the outside lessons that my kids were doing, like music lessons, that kind of thing. And we would live a wild and free life. I just had all these visions of us having such a fantastic unschooling life together. So we moved, I think, maybe a couple of days before Christmas, the middle of summer. And yes, moving in was an adventure. A couple of days later, the kids started asking, when are we going to get that dog, Mum? So once Christmas was over, I headed back into town to look for a dog. I came home with a Kelpie cross, and her name was Rocket. And she was, I think, about 13 months old. And when we got her home, we suddenly realised we had a problem. All the fences around the fish farm weren't in good repair. It didn't take us long to realise that our dog could escape, and she wasn't a very well trained dog, and we should have realised that we were taking on a problem, because when I went to get this dog, the owner said, I'm so sad to see her go, but she has escaped from our property too many times. I have to keep going down to the animal shelter to pick her up, because the dog would get out onto the road, she would go roaming. Someone would find her, take her down to the animal shelter, and then the woman would get a call. Your dog is down at the animal shelter again, come and collect her. So I wasn't very sensible, was I? We ended up on this fish farm with this dog who was an escapee. Now, the day we got the dog, we had one neighbour, and unfortunately her cottage was right on the boundary line of our two properties. Ours wasn't far from the boundary line either. Can you imagine 100 acres, and we were within sight of somebody else's home. And the woman, she came running up to the fence. She saw our dog, and she said, if that dog gets onto my property, I will shoot it. Oh my. Yes, can you imagine that? I not only had to look after all my kids, I had to make sure I knew where that dog was every moment of the day. Now, kind friends came along and they helped us build a fence around the house and a bit of the garden to keep the dog in, but we didn't have a gate. And for some reason, it seemed like a big job to go to town and find a gate and to get it installed. So we never did that. The other reason we needed a big fence around the property was we had a lot of snakes. So much for letting my kids roam wild and free. I couldn't afford to do that, not with little ones. They had to be fairly close to the house where we mowed the grass so that we could see them and the snakes. But the snakes weren't the only problem. We had a lot of rats. We could hear them at night. Well, we could hear them any time of day, but at night we could hear them most. And I used to lie there in bed listening to them in the wall cavities. And because we had a few holes in the walls, I lay there thinking, any moment now these rats are going to come through the holes and they're going to run along the floor and they're going to jump up on the bed. We're going to have rats everywhere. Every morning our mouse traps were full. We just couldn't seem to get rid of them all. So I went back to town again, and I came back with 2 cats. Well, they were kittens. I thought, these kittens will grow into cats, and they'll keep our mouse and our rat population down. Well, they weren't very good ratters or mouses, and we had to learn to live with our rodent population. But even the rats weren't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was water. We weren't connected to town water because we were a long way away from town. So we relied on rainwater. And rain should have fallen on our roof, should have gone along the gutters, should have gone down into the pipe, into this big tank. Well, it never rained. We were in drought that year. And any rain we did have, it went straight through the holes in the gutter. It bypassed the tank altogether. And so I was continually ringing up the water carrier, and they would send out a truck of water for us. They would connect up a hose between the truck and our tank, and we'd all stand around, and water would be pumped into our tank. Now, this happened approximately every 6 weeks. Despite being very frugal with our water, my kids were dirty because we couldn't have many showers or wash our clothes, let alone they were supposed to be wild and free because they were roaming the property, and we didn't care about things like that. But I did sort of imagine that every now and then I could wash their clothes and we could all have deep baths and lots of showers, but no. I used to bath the baby in the kitchen sink, and everybody used to share a bath load of water or have a very, very quick shower. And I was always cutting water from the bath to the washing machine and reusing it. I mean, that sounds disgusting, doesn't it? But this was just a fact of life. We had no water. But when the water truck came and the tank was filled, for at least a few hours, we felt rich. We had water. And I'd head in the shower and I'd do a load of washing and I think, wow, we've got water. And then all of a sudden I think, no, we've got to conserve water again and we'll stop using it. But I suppose that wasn't even the biggest problem. A bigger problem than that was the travel. Going into town just for music lessons was bad enough. But my husband Andy had to go all the way into the lower areas of Sydney. And 2.5 hours there, 2.5 hours back. You can imagine he was exhausted. He didn't find another job. Well, he tried, but I don't know. The weeks went by and then they turned into months and no job appeared. But we thought, oh look, keep persevering. We came for an adventure. We've got to give this time. We can't just run back to town because of a few rats and no water, and we've got to be tough enough to deal with the travel. Yes, this is what we wanted, and maybe in the end we'll end up with a home of our own. Now, by this time, I was pregnant with our 6th child. I'd already imagined, having the baby out at the cottage and sitting outside, breastfeeding, and while I watched all the other kids, and this baby was going to grow up in the country. Now, one afternoon I had to go into town to have an ultrasound. So I arranged with Andy to meet him near the hospital. He would come south from work and I would go north from the cottage. We would meet at the hospital. I would give him the kids and he would take them to the park and I would go into the ultrasound. Now, we had so many children, 5 children at the time, so we didn't think that it was a good idea for us both to go to the ultrasound. So I was there alone when I saw our son at the 18-week ultrasound for the very first time. And as you can imagine, that was very, very exciting. Well, the excitement lasted a minute or two. The technician who was doing the ultrasound all of a sudden said to me, "I'll be back in a moment." And I just lay there. I mean, you can't really go anywhere, can you? And looked at the screen at our baby and soaked it all up. And a couple of minutes later, a doctor appeared with a technician. And I can just remember the look in his eye. He just was so full of compassion. He touched my arm and he said, "I'm very sorry to tell you that your son has an abnormality incompatible with life." And I sort of lay there thinking about that. An abnormality incompatible with life. He was going to die after he was born. But then I thought, no, it's only the 18-week ultrasound. There's plenty of time for something to be done. We've got months ahead of us. So this is what I expressed to the doctor. And he said, "No, there's nothing we can do." And I know these days, my son had a diaphragmatic hernia. And after he was born, I mean, this was a few years ago, and I know that since then, I've seen reports and documentaries about babies with a similar condition who have had surgery while they've still been in their uterus. But at the time, there was no option. Now, the problem was that because of that hole in the diaphragm, all my son's organs, like his kidneys and all these internal organs, they had moved up and they'd gone through the hole and they were taking up space in the lung cavity. So the doctor said there is very little room for the lungs to develop, which is not a problem before the baby is born, but he predicted that our son wouldn't have enough lung tissue for independent breathing after he was born. Now, of course, we always hope, don't we? Whatever our situation is, whatever the bad news that we've been given, we don't want to give up hope. And I thought, well, maybe the doctor is wrong, but of course, it hit me all of a sudden that I was maybe facing the fact, going to face our son dying. He was going to be born, he would die. I would hold him in my arms, I would arrange his funeral. I would be there while they lowered his coffin into the ground. And I thought, this is not what I was expecting. I was expecting to have him in my arms, to bring him up, to have him part of my life for a long, long time. How could I give birth to him and survive all that grief? I wasn't strong enough, I was sure. I thought, no, I can't do this. But of course, I had no choice. And I think that's what hit me, that I had to go forward from that day onwards. It was coming at me. Every day that passed, his birth would come closer. The day when he would die would come closer. The day when I'd have to stand by his grave, it was coming. And I'd have to deal with it all. And I was okay until the doctor said, "Oh, we finished. You can go and get dressed now." And I got down off the couch and I went into the bathroom, and the grief, it hit me straight away. And I just was crying and crying. I went out to the reception area to pay for the ultrasound, and tears streaming down my face, and the receptionist said to me, "That's okay." She said, "There's no charge." And I went out thinking, I wonder why there's no charge. Do they only charge mothers who are going to have babies who live? They don't charge for babies who are going to die. And by this time Andy was outside the hospital, and as I came out, he knew there was something wrong. My eyes were all red, tears flowing. He just opened his arms and said, "Sue, what's wrong?" I said, "He's going to die." I didn't even know our baby was a boy then. I said, our baby is going to die. And that was the start of such grief for us. A very, very difficult time, which lasted a long time. We all drove home to the cottage, and we had to face the future. And all of a sudden, the cottage wasn't important. Growing our own vegetables wasn't important. We didn't want to struggle anymore with water shortages. All we could think of was the baby. We wanted to be near the hospital so that we could have access to the hospital and good doctors. We wanted to be on town water. We wanted to turn the tap and see water appear. We didn't want to have to worry about it anymore. We had enough to worry about. We didn't want to go grow our own food, which we didn't actually do because no water to grow the vegetables and the soil was poor. We wanted to give up the adventure and just live a conventional life in town, an ordinary life, a normal life. But our life wasn't normal anymore. And our worries about providing a rich enough environment for our kids, oh well. We were surrounded by rich learning experiences, weren't we? Ones that nobody would ever ask for. They're experiences that we all learnt from, but who wants to know about grief? Who wants to know about how you organise a funeral, or what you put on a headstone, or what's suitable for a baby? Who wants to work out how to survive the death of a child? Well, our son was born, and he lived for 28 and a quarter hours. I guess that quarter is important. Such a short time of life. And before we knew it, he was being disconnected from all his equipment. He was put on life support as he was born, and the doctors did their best to save him. But in the end, it wasn't his lungs that gave out because he was on a respirator. It was his heart. And we didn't have to make that horrible decision about disconnecting him from life support. No doctor came up to us and said, we can't do any more. You'll have to disconnect him. They did come up to us and say, I'm sorry, we can't do any more. He's not responding to treatment. But we just let him die naturally. All the non-essential wiring and tubing was disconnected, but he was left on the respirator. And we took turns to hold him as he died. And I'll never forget the looks on my kids' faces at that time. I mean, that's the sort of thing I thought that no child could survive. But of course they did, and I survived as well. We learnt a lot. And for a long time, we just closed ranks. We just kept together, leaned on each other, and it was just us against all the problems. But, the thing we learnt most about was love. And, it doesn't matter whether you live in a yurt. It doesn't matter whether you live in a camper van. It does not matter whether you go travelling around the world or your own country, or live on a farm and grow your own vegetables, live in a tumble-down cottage on a fish farm. None of that matters. Our kids will be fine as long as they live in a home that is full of unconditional love. That's what kids need more than anything. You can give your kids that kind of love anywhere, whether you're in town, in the country, in a camper van. So that's my story, I guess. That was a big learning experience for us. These days, we don't live in town, but we do live in a conventional style house with town water. We have access to the supermarkets and all that, but we're very fortunate. We live in a village just outside of town, so we're surrounded by bush. We can go down to the bush every day, it's just 100 metres down the road. We have all kinds of birds visiting our garden. At the moment, we've got yellow-tailed black cockatoos who are feeding off the hakea seeds in the trees that run along the boundary of our property. And they come down and I can hear them cracking open the seeds, and they snip off twigs and branches from the hakea tree, and they fall down below, and I can hear all that, and I can see it happening from my kitchen window. Other birds as well. We go down to the bush. If we're down there early enough in the morning, maybe just after sunrise, we might see a kangaroo or two. We see lyrebirds, echidnas. Sometimes we see a snake. We have nature on our doorstep, but we don't have to look after it. We don't have to grow our own vegetables. I think that we've got what's the best of both worlds. We're living somewhere that's perfect for us. Maybe not perfect for everybody, but we're fortunate that we're living in a place that we love. Most important of all, we've learnt the lesson of what kids need, and we are trying to fill this house with unconditional love. So, there's my story for today. So I hope you enjoyed listening to that one, and maybe I'll have another story for you very soon. Thank you for watching.